Hello! Greetings, salutations, and all the other things that I can say to stall for time as I start off episode 172 of Zilog and Moto. If you're not familiar with Zilog and Moto, well, my name is Dave, and here at Zilog and Moto, I've got one mission, one prime directive, if you will. About 7 years ago now, and I know this because Facebook very nicely decided to remind me of some pictures that I posted a few days ago, I decided that I was going to start collecting games that I could play on my favorite console growing up, the Sega Genesis. And I wasn't just going to collect a few games that I liked or remembered from back in the 90s, I was going to collect all of the games that I could play on that Genesis. Which means Genesis games, Master System games, Sega CD games, and even the games for that wacky, often shunned mushroom-shaped add-on, the 32X. And if you know anything about those libraries, you know that there's tons of games in English that weren't released in the United States, so hey, let's collect those as well. And now, this channel, Zilog and Moto, is the result of that decision, and every week I pick up a game from that collection and take a look at it, inside and out, reviewing its packaging, manual, and of course the game itself, all while playing on original hardware when possible, to get the best possible look at these titles. And yes, I know every week needs to be in giant quotation marks because I don't always quite hit that mark, but that's the goal anyway. Okay, enough with all that introduction crap. I know you're probably bored out there already or have skipped through to later off in the video, so I'll get on with it. Today's video sees us on the Master System again with a game that I think is pretty obscure despite the fact that it was released in all three of the major markets, North America, Europe, and Japan. That game is Parlour Games. Wait, Parlour Game? Why the hell is there an extra U in there? This is one of the times that Sega makes me mad, and I can kind of understand why Nintendo kicked their ass early on. There was absolutely no reason to use the British spelling on a game that wouldn't even be released in Europe until about 2 years after it was released in the United States. If it had come out in Europe first, okay, I get it. But this is just Sega being difficult. And I suppose that I should mention that this was a completely self-inflicted wound because when the game debuted in Japan, it was known as Family Games. Now, okay, granted, Family Games, not necessarily the most exciting name in the world, but at least it was spelled correctly. Parlour Games, or Family Games, however you refer to it as, is a collection of multiple games that you might just play in some sort of parlor, consisting of billiards, darts, and something referred to as World Bingo. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between a regular game of bingo and a World Bingo, but maybe I'll find that out during the review. That, or it's just some sort of weird translation thing, and it really means nothing. I mean, both are completely possible. Playing billiards and darts in a video game is something that's pretty common these days, even in games that aren't dedicated to those sports. Grand Theft Auto features bare-bones versions of both the side activities, and the Yakuza series usually has more full-featured versions in the games, with some story elements directly involving playing those games. But GTA 4 and Yakuza are obviously games that are designed for hardware much more powerful than the Master System. What about Parlour Games? What was Sega and Compile able to get out of the 8-bit console that could? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package.
And this is Parlour Games, yes, complete with that annoying extra U in the title. This copy is in pretty good shape, not perfect certainly, and the hang tab has been removed from the top of the case, in somewhat rough fashion apparently. Not sure what was going on there. However, even though the outer cover has a few blemishes, the inner cover is held up well, with no apparent damage to any of the artwork. Parlour Games currently goes for between $10 to $15 on price charting, so if I wanted to, I could probably seek out a cleaner version relatively cheaply, but I'm good with it as is, especially since the manual is in good condition, as we'll get to in a minute. A few things to note about this front cover. First, to the upper left, there's a note about how the game is for up to 4 players. Now, of course, with this being a Master System game, this means that there's going to be some controller passing to pull that off, but I do find it interesting that they mention it on the front cover. Not just because it's a good selling point, but also if you flip over to the back, you'll notice that since this was such an early release on the console, Sega hadn't come up with the idea of having these standard stats boxes on the back yet, where normally you would look to see things like number of players, number of levels, and which controllers were supported for playing the game. So they really needed to put that on the front. Also on the front cover, check out the Family Fun logo at the top, which makes sense for a game that literally was originally called Family Games. I'm pretty certain that this is the only Master System game that features that logo, but if I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the comments below. However, I say that because by the time that Casino Games, the spiritual sequel to Parlour Games that I covered back in episode 72, was released almost a year and a half later in September of 1989, Sega had switched to the newer formatting of the covers, with the genre of the game listed in the upper left-hand corner instead. Finally, one last note about the cover art, and this is something that Greg Seward of Generation 16 pointed out with this great tweet. The person on that cover clearly doesn't know how to play any of those games. And he's right. In typical early Master System fashion, the cover art here is a head-scratcher at best, with the players shooting at a 5-ball instead of the cue, while on top of a bingo card that's being used as a dartboard. Unsurprisingly, the Japanese cover is much classier and doesn't appear to be out of a fever dream. Never change, Sega. Flipping over to the back briefly, we got the standard 2-screenshot rear layout, with bingo probably deservedly getting bumped for shots of darts and pool. And they're not horrible, but I've definitely seen better. Below that is some nice flavor text selling the more than expected options that are included, and I like how that the game is early enough to where the console is still being referred to as the Sega System rather than the Master System. Opening up the box, and the manual is in good shape, but more importantly, it is huge. Seriously, look how thick this manual is. I was not expecting that at all, but apparently it's so big because these are not bare bones versions of these games. Oh no, we've definitely got some options here to mix up gameplay a bit, and Sega was thoughtful enough to provide explanations for how to play all those different variations of the games. Okay, I'm kind of excited now. It seems like there's some meat to this game that seemed a bit thin on the surface. Let's get to the game and see if it's just average or if Compile indeed over-delivered. I mentioned in the last section that I'd previously reviewed what's essentially the sequel to this game, Casino Games, back in Season 2 of the channel, 100 episodes ago. Now, if I'd been thinking, I would have covered Parlour Games first, as I do try to go in chronological order for games that are part of a series. And to me, with the similarities in naming convention, the shared developer of both titles, and the fact that both titles are made up of individual minigames, I think that's close enough to at least unofficially consider them part of the same series. I'm not sure how I messed that up exactly, but I think it's because at the time, I didn't realize that both games were developed by the talented folks at Compile, who of course would later go on to find fame with being the brains behind the popular Least shooter series, i.e. Power Strike and Musha, and then also the Puyo Puyo puzzle game series. As stated, both Casino Games and Parlour Games consist of individual activities, but while Casino Games focused on card games you might find in said casino, along with a slot machine and a really oddly placed pinball machine, Parlour Games instead selects 3 games that you're more likely to run into in a slightly less glamorous den of iniquity, say perhaps the local bar and grill or a bingo hall. Let's start with looking at darts, for no other reason than that's the first of the 3 games that I tried. Most people should be familiar with darts in general. You have a dartboard, you hang it on the wall, and you throw darts at the dartboard, trying to land the darts in specific scoring sections on the board to score points. However, what people may not be familiar with are the types of games that are built around darts. For Parlour Games, they've included 4 variations to play: 301, 501, Round the Clock, and Double Down. 301 is probably the game that most people are familiar with darts know how to play. Well, aside from those that just throw and try to get a high score, I suppose. 301 works by having the player start at a score of 301, and by throwing darts at the dartboard and successfully hitting a scoring target, they get that score subtracted from their current score, with the goal being to be the first person to get their score down to 0 without going over. This works in-game exactly as you think it would, with you playing either by yourself, against the computer, in a one-on-one match, or with up to 3 friends alternating turns. 501 is the same as 301, but just starting at a higher score for a longer game experience. Even though it's basically the same game, I like that they included the variation to give the players another option. Then there's Round the Clock, which to me is the simplest of the 4 games, just requiring players to hit the targets 1 through 10 in order, with the first person completing the run being the winner. Nothing too exciting about that, but it's definitely a different experience from 301 or 501 for some variety. Finally, the most interesting game variation of the four that was included is Double Down. In Double Down, each player has 9 turns and starts out with 40 points. In each turn, you must attempt to hit a specific target on the board, and each time you hit that target, you get the points added to your score. But if you don't hit the target with any of your 3 throws, your score will be cut in half. This process runs until the final turn, which requires the player to hit the bullseye. Nothing against 301, but I was the most excited when playing this game mode because of that possibility of losing half your points every turn if you mess up. It really serves to level the playing field. Even if someone gets out to a large lead, all it takes is one bad turn to make things competitive again. I think Compile did a good job of giving the player plenty of options when playing darts. This could have been a much more bare-bones setup and still technically qualified as darts. Along with supporting 4 players or a computer opponent, the computer opponent has 2 difficulty levels that can be chosen, and for 301 and 501, you have the option of starting and ending on doubles to add an extra challenge for players. The problem is the implementation of the actual gameplay. To throw a dart, you have control over 3 elements: where you stand from left to right, how hard you throw the dart, and how far into your throw that you release the dart. I like the simplicity of the left to right motion, but the strength and release is a problem. Essentially, you have to hold button 2 to raise the strength bar to where you want it, which is fine. The problem then comes is that immediately after you let go of button 2, you have to tap it again to target your release timing. This comes off as awkward and more than a bit tricky, which is a problem for something like, darts, where you're trying to land in a precise location. One other option that was provided was to change the weight of the dart, which affects where the strength and release should be to hit the target, and that's nice of Compile to think of, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem. Let's move on to billiards. Like with darts, Compile included 4 variations of gameplay, which includes the 4 most common varieties that most people would be familiar with. Well, sort of. Included in Parlour Games is straight pool, referred to in game as basic game, 9-ball, rotation, and 5-ball? I've played a lot of pool in my time, but I've never heard of 5-ball. And where the hell is 8-ball? Probably the most well-known variety of pool. This is where that sort of disclaimer I threw in a minute ago comes in. Apparently Compile wasn't able, or chose not to, design a table engine that included 16 balls. Instead, there's a limit of just 11, consisting of 10 numbered balls in the queue. This is where 5-ball comes in, as it's a modified version of 8-ball, but designed to be played with a 9-ball setup. I actually don't mind this, and I appreciate that each of the balls that are present are well labeled, something that you would think would be simple, but I recall having a problem with that previously in Championship Pool on the Genesis. Of course, having a normal 16-ball setup would be preferable, but if this was necessary for performance or gameplay reasons, I get it, and all it really does is make the non-9-ball matches quicker, as there are less balls on the table to deal with. Correct number of balls or no, the pool engine is probably as good as can be expected. Control of shots is simple, with being able to choose where the shots are aimed, and then how hard the cue is struck by simple timing. And finally, being able to choose where on the cue you strike via crosshair, just in case you need to try adding curve or English to your shot. Fouls and scratches are called correctly, and for both straight pool and rotation, you can choose the amount of points to be played before a game starts to control the length of the game. And you can even set the amount of matches needed to win, rather than just playing one-off games, if you want to do a best of 3, 5-7, etc. Overall, the pool representation is decent, but I've got 2 issues with it. One that I think is somewhat unavoidable, and one that just doesn't feel right at all. The first issue is that aiming is a bit problematic. The game is played from a top-down view, which is fine and what I would expect from the era. The issue comes with the angles of the shots being available for a player are somewhat limited. If you know anything about pool, you know that it literally is a game of angles, and not being able to line up shots the way you want them kinda sucks. I'm not sure they could have done much about this though, as it seems like an engine problem, with the fine-tuning of shots just not being available. Given that there's some hardware limitations that I think they were dealing with here, this I'm somewhat forgiving of. However, the other problem is that the physics in the game seem entirely off. Playing on the table feels like playing in mud, and even when choosing the most powerful shot, breaks and other shots are frequently terrible. Single shots fare a bit better, but even still, the balls simply don't move around as well as you might expect, which can again be frustrating. The final game included is World Bingo, and man, this is a weird one. I can only assume the game was made up for this release, as I couldn't find a reference to a similar version of Bingo on Google. The game is for up to 4 players, and each can choose their own bingo card, which has the numbers 1 through 25 in a 5x5 layout. Before you start play, you can wager money in $1 increments, with each wager having the chance to raise your potential winnings, unlock blocks of numbers on the card, unlock the center number, or unlock the possibility of winning money via the corner numbers. How are the numbers picked? Well, via slot machine, of course, duh. For each number, the slot machine is pulled, and if you get a number and a smiley face, the number is chosen. But if a frowny face pops up, you have to spin again. After each of the first 3 pulls, you can move the numbers and the blocks around, assuming you bet enough to unlock any of them, so some strategy is involved as well. But the last 2 pulls leave your fate to chance. Get 3, 4, or 5 numbers in a row, or the corners if you've unlocked them, and you'll win money, and of course the end goal is to win more money than anyone else. World Bingo is fine for what it is once you figure out how to play it, but I don't see myself having a huge urge to go back to it. The graphics in Parlour Games are probably about what you would expect. Not bad, but nothing to get excited about either. I like the anime-styled cutscene art, for lack of a better term, that displays between games, and the in-game engine graphics for each of the 3 game modes is clean, with no glitches or flickering. It looks pretty much how you would expect a simple, somewhat early Master System game to look, for better or worse. However, what I found more impressive than the graphics was the sound. The sound effects used are decent, but the music is what I really liked. Each of the background tracks are composed really well, with a good variety between them, and there's a decent amount of them also, so you're not going to be stuck listening to the same 3 songs the entire time, which is especially nice when you have repetitive gameplay. Also, as you may have noticed on the Japanese cover, Parlour Games does support the FM audio module, and while some of the instrumentation of the FM soundtrack is clearly more advanced, like with previous FM audio games, I'm not sure that I would call it better. But if you have the option for FM audio playback, it's certainly worth a listen to compare. Parlour Games is a game that I think is decent conceptually. I mean, I like pool and darts, and bingo isn't bad either, so why wouldn't I want to play them all in one place? And the fact that it has tons of in-game options included for those game modes shows that Compile clearly put some effort into the title, as to release something that actually had some depth to it, and that would offer the player some expanded replayability. Unfortunately, the actual gameplay in darts and pool just isn't quite up to snuff, and it ends up being somewhat frustrating, especially when playing a computer opponent that clearly doesn't have the same limitations of a human player. Due to the fact that it dates all the way back to 1987 for the Japanese version, I'm giving Parlour Games 2 stars, as I'm sure it was an entertaining game for the era, especially from a multiplayer aspect. But it simply hasn't aged well, and I don't see anyone going back to this just to play poorly controlling darts and pool.
Okay, that was Parlour Games for the Master System. Did I think before playing Altered Beast last week that I would like Parlour Games better than it? No, not really, but here we are, and Compile actually overachieving a bit with Parlour Games. If Parlour Games had even slightly better controls with darts and physics in pool that didn't feel like trying to make shots on a table made of molasses, I think it would be a classic game that would be well worth revisiting. But as is, you're better off playing Yakuza. I mean, you're better off playing Yakuza than doing a lot of things, so probably not completely fair, but I'm going with it. Tune in next week as we'll be on the Master System for one more week before a specially requested Halloween-themed review, sort of. Anyway, next week's review has me looking at the Master System port of a Genesis game that I previously reviewed and I really wanted to like, but some of the worst control that I've experienced so far on the channel completely derailed things. And I mean completely. That game got a bomb for a good reason. I'm hoping that maybe the Master System version will fare a bit better, as I'd gladly trade graphics for, I don't know, any controls that made sense, but we'll just have to see. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 172. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.